Picture this. You're sitting across from someone, calmly walking them through a perfectly logical point. Your argument is clear, your evidence is solid, and yet, somehow, impossibly, they stare back at you with complete and total blankness. Not confusion, not curiosity. Blankness. Here's what nobody tells you about that moment. It isn't a communication failure. It isn't a misunderstanding. What you're actually witnessing is the brain working exactly at the edge of its capacity and quietly shutting the door on anything beyond it. Today, we are not talking about education levels, test scores, or academic backgrounds. We are talking about 7 deeply revealing behavioral patterns that expose how a mind truly functions when it believes nobody is watching. These aren't insults. They're psychological realities. And once you recognize them, you will never waste your mental energy the same way again. Trait 1. The need for absolute simplicity. The first pattern appears in how someone handles complexity. Every situation in life exists on a spectrum. Relationships are layered. Decisions have consequences that branch in multiple directions. Truth itself is rarely black or white. It lives somewhere in the difficult, uncomfortable middle. A cognitively powerful mind navigates that middle ground naturally. It sits comfortably in uncertainty, weighing competing ideas without the need to immediately resolve them. But watch what a cognitively limited mind does differently. It collapses everything. Every situation becomes either completely good or completely terrible. Every person is either fully trustworthy or entirely corrupt. There is no in between, because the mental energy required to hold nuance is simply unavailable. You'll hear it clearly in their language. This always happens. Nobody ever listens. Everyone is against me. These aren't dramatic expressions. They're cognitive shortcuts. The brain reducing a complicated world into something it can actually process. Trait 2. The paradox of misplaced certainty. The second pattern is perhaps the most ironic truth in all of human psychology. The smarter someone actually is, the more uncertain they tend to feel, because true intelligence continuously reveals how much remains unknown. Brilliant minds carry a permanent, healthy discomfort with the gaps in their own understanding. Now, here is where it gets deeply revealing. Research from Cornell University discovered something remarkable. People with the lowest actual competency levels consistently rated themselves as above average performers, not because they were arrogant, but because they genuinely lacked the cognitive capacity to measure their own limitations accurately. They couldn't see their blind spots, because their blind spots were too large to fit within their field of vision. When you encounter someone radiating absolute, unshakable confidence about a subject they've barely scratched the surface of, you're not watching boldness. You're watching a measuring instrument that is fundamentally broken. Trait 3. Emotional reality versus factual reality. The third pattern involves the relationship between feelings and facts, and which direction that relationship flows. For a developed mind, facts arrive first. Emotions adjust accordingly. New information updates the understanding, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. But for a cognitively limited mind, the sequence is completely reversed. Emotions arrive first, and permanently. Then facts get filtered, twisted, or rejected, depending entirely on whether they support the emotional position already held. If information feels threatening, it becomes a lie. If a new idea feels validating, it automatically becomes truth. This is not dishonesty. This is a mind that has no other available mechanism. It cannot separate what it feels from what is actually real, because to them, those two things were never different to begin with. Watch how someone responds when presented with evidence that contradicts their existing belief. If they engage with the evidence, their mind is functioning. If they immediately attack the source, their emotions just exposed everything. Before we move forward, I need you to genuinely ask yourself something. Think about the most exhausting conversation you've ever had. The one where you walked away, not just tired, but confused. Because no matter how clearly you communicated, how carefully you chose your words, or how solid your reasoning was, nothing landed. That conversation drained you, specifically because you were operating on logic, while they were operating on emotional self-protection. If this is already making sense of patterns you've experienced personally, drop a single word in the comments. Just type clarity, because something shifts the moment you name what you've been unconsciously sensing. Trait 4. Volume ASA substitute for intelligence. The fourth pattern reveals itself most clearly during disagreements. When a mind possesses real depth, It responds to challenges with questions. It gets genuinely curious. It explores the opposing perspective to understand it better, even while disagreeing with it. A cognitively limited mind cannot access that mechanism under pressure, so it reaches for the only weapon it has left: volume and repetition. Watch carefully during conflict. The person with less cognitive flexibility will not ask you a single genuine question. Instead, they will take their original point, amplify the delivery, and repeat it louder, as though your problem with their argument was simply that you hadn't heard it clearly enough the first time. To their internal logic, whoever controls the noise controls the conversation, because they have never experienced a disagreement being resolved through intellectual exchange. For them, it has always been resolved through domination. They don't argue to discover truth, they argue to survive it. Trait 5. Beliefs as identity, not information, the fifth pattern, is one of the most important you'll ever understand. Cognitively flexible people treat their beliefs like working hypotheses, always subject to revision when better information arrives. Their identity does not depend on being right. It depends on eventually getting closer to the truth. A cognitively limited person cannot make that separation. Their beliefs aren't information they hold. Their beliefs are who they are. This means that when you challenge their idea, you are not presenting a counter-argument. You are attacking their identity at its very core. And the defensive response you receive, the hostility, the deflection, the sudden aggression, isn't irrational behavior. It's self-preservation. Understanding this single pattern eliminates most of the confusion and hurt feelings that come from trying to change someone's mind who was never actually listening to begin with.
Trait 6. Living entirely in the present moment, but not in a good way. The sixth pattern involves time, specifically the complete inability to connect present actions to future consequences. Strategic thinking requires the brain to run mental simulations of future scenarios, to ask, if I do this now, what happens 3 steps from now? What are the second and third order consequences of this decision? A cognitively limited mind cannot run those simulations. It can only react to what exists directly in front of it right now, in this exact moment. This is why these individuals consistently find themselves trapped in crisis, genuinely unable to trace their current disaster back to the preventable decision they made weeks earlier. And it's why they frequently misread coincidence as cause, seeing false patterns everywhere, while missing the actual ones. They are chess players who can only see the board one move at a time in a game that punishes exactly that.
Trait 7. Feedback as attack the seventh and final pattern brings everything together. Growth requires one fundamental ability: looking at yourself honestly, identifying what isn't working, and adjusting without collapsing. But when cognitive resources are limited, the ego cannot afford that kind of exposure. Any observation about their behavior, regardless of how gently it's offered, lands as a direct assault on their worth as a person. They cannot separate their performance from their identity, so correcting what they did feels identical to rejecting who they are. And from that place, the only available responses are deflection, victimhood, or immediate counterattack. They will never say, "You're right, I should do that differently," because hearing that sentence would require them to tolerate a version of themselves that is imperfect and that is cognitively more than they can bear. Here is what this knowledge is truly for. It is not for judgment. It is not for superiority. It is not for dismissing people who are simply wired differently than you are. It is for one thing only: protecting your peace. The moment you recognize that the exhausting person across from you is operating at the absolute boundary of their cognitive capacity, something shifts. The frustration softens. The confusion clears. You stop expecting a machine to perform a function it was never built to perform. You stop arguing with a locked door and simply find another room. Real intelligence has always been exactly this: knowing when to engage, when to listen carefully, and when to quietly, permanently walk away. The most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who know the least. They are the ones who know the least, while being completely certain they know the most. Now, you know exactly what that looks like. If this perspective changed the way you see people, or perhaps the way you see yourself, make sure to subscribe, because understanding human psychology isn't about controlling others. It's about mastering yourself.